The story began on a sweltering summer day in rural Tennessee. Richard Harding, a retired Wall Street tycoon, sat stewing in his gleaming silver Mercedes, sweat beading on his brow and frustration etched across his face. His luxury car had decided to stage a dramatic protest against the heat, slumping onto the deserted roadside with a disheartening thump, thump, thump. A flat tire, the right rear to be precise, now resembling nothing more than a deflated pancake. To add insult to injury, his cell phone displayed the dreaded no-service message. His sprawling estate, with all its opulent comforts and the illusion of control he so carefully cultivated, felt a million miles away. Suddenly, all the power and convenience he had built his life around seemed utterly meaningless against the simple, inconvenient truth of a punctured tire. Richard, a man accustomed to having the world operate according to his meticulously crafted plans, felt a familiar surge of irritation. He took a deep breath, attempting to regain his composure, but the relentless heat and the sheer helplessness of the situation chipped away at his carefully constructed facade of control. Just as his teeth began to grind, a flicker of movement at the far end of the dusty road caught his eye. A figure emerged, small and wiry, silhouetted against the shimmering heat haze. It was a boy, maybe 13 or 14, clad in a faded t-shirt and well-worn sneakers, their laces frayed. But there was something about his stride, a confident energy in his approach, that belied his age and humble appearance. He walked directly toward the stranded Mercedes, his gaze assessing the situation with a quiet focus. Reaching the car, he nodded politely, but with an unexpected firmness to Richard. "Flat tire, sir?" His voice was small but clear, devoid of hesitation. Richard, momentarily taken aback by the boy's directness, managed a surprised, "Yes, it is." A peculiar mix of relief and bewilderment washed over him. "I could certainly use some help, but my phone's dead out here." A faint smile touched the boy's lips. "I can help you with that." Without another word, he knelt beside the flattened tire, his movements decisive and sure. "Grandpa taught me how to change a tire last summer." Richard gestured vaguely toward the trunk. The boy opened the trunk, efficiently retrieving the spare tire and tools. His hands moved with practiced ease, his actions betraying a competence far beyond his years. In that moment, a strange sense of humility washed over Richard, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He found himself wanting to offer something, anything, in return, but the boy remained intensely focused on the task at hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. Within minutes, the spare was in place, the flat tire stowed away. The boy wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped back. "All set," he announced simply, a small, satisfied smile gracing his lips. Richard reached for his wallet, pulling out a generous handful of bills. "Here, take this. I really appreciate you helping me out." But the boy recoiled slightly, politely raising a hand. "Thank you, sir, but I don't need anything." He paused, his gaze direct and unwavering. "I was just glad to help." Richard stared, bills still extended in his hand, as the boy turned and started walking back down the dusty road. The brief encounter resonated within him, stirring something deep and unfamiliar, a feeling he couldn't quite name. Alone in his car, he tucked the money back into his wallet and finally drove off. But the image of the boy lingered in his mind. He possessed a quiet composure, a self-assurance that had nothing to do with wealth or status, but seemed rooted in something far more substantial. That evening, within the opulent confines of his mansion, Richard found himself unable to shake the image of the boy walking away with that quiet smile. In the hushed stillness of his study, punctuated only by the soft tick of a grandfather clock, his gourmet dinner, a perfectly seared steak and asparagus, remained untouched on the table. His thoughts were consumed by the boy. Throughout his life, Richard had interacted with thousands of people, business partners, employees, investors. Most interactions revolved around negotiations, favors, and deals. There was always an exchange, a price, or an expectation. But this boy, this stranger, had helped him with no expectation of reward, offering nothing but kindness. Richard took a sip of his single malt scotch, the boy's confident smile flashing again in his mind's eye. The boy hadn't looked wealthy. the worn shoes, the faded clothes, the dust-streaked hands. They all told a story of a different kind of life, and yet he carried within him a quality Richard had rarely encountered in his own gilded world: integrity. The next morning, Richard couldn't shake the urge to find the boy. He couldn't explain it, but something felt unfinished, incomplete. Perhaps it was guilt, gratitude, or simple curiosity. Whatever it was, he found himself driving back down the same country road, searching for a glimpse of that small figure. Hours trickled by as Richard drove along dusty roads, stopping at gas stations and roadside diners, inquiring about a boy matching Jake's description. Most people shrugged or shook their heads until, at a tiny, sun-drenched diner, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a warm smile said, "Sounds like you're talking about Jake. That boy's always helping folks around here. Lives up in Harlan with his mama." Harlan! Richard committed the name to memory. Harlan, a town nestled in the Appalachian foothills, was about an hour's drive away. The drive was scenic, but Richard barely noticed. His mind raced with questions. What was the boy's life like? What kind of family raised a child with such inherent goodness? Harlan was a town of quiet streets lined with modest homes and small businesses, a place where life seemed to move at a slower, more deliberate pace. He asked a few locals about Jake and eventually was directed to a small house on the edge of town. It was an older house, but neat, with a porch that sagged slightly on one side. Richard parked and hesitated for a moment, unsure of what he would say. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. A woman in her 40s answered. She looked tired but kind, her eyes sharp and curious as she took in Richard's expensive suit and polished shoes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice gentle but cautious. "Good morning," Richard said, clearing his throat. "Forgive me for intruding, but I believe I met your son yesterday. Jake? He helped me change a flat tire." Her face softened instantly. "That sounds just like him," she smiled, a genuine warmth spreading across her features. "He's always looking out for others." "I just wanted to thank him properly," Richard explained. "He wouldn't accept anything from me yesterday." She nodded, stepping aside to invite him in. "He's out back in the garden. Why don't you go on out?" Richard stepped inside, his gaze taking in the simple furnishings. The furniture was worn but clean, the walls adorned with family photos and a few crayon drawings that looked like they might be the work of a younger Jake. It was a world away from his mansion, with its designer furniture and priceless artwork. But there was a warmth here, a lived-in feeling that his own meticulously curated spaces lacked. He followed her through the house and out into the backyard, where Jake was mending a section of fence. The boy looked up, surprised to see Richard. "Hey, sir," Jake said, wiping his hands on his pants. "What brings you here?" Richard smiled, feeling a surprising flutter of nerves. "I wanted to thank you again. You really helped me out yesterday, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it." Jake shrugged, his expression open and sincere. It wasn't a big deal, but to Richard it was a big deal, and he was determined to show it. Jake leaned against the fence, studying Richard with an earnest gaze. A comfortable silence settled between them. The boy's quiet composure made Richard feel strangely exposed, as if he were the one being assessed. "You don't understand what a big deal it was," Richard finally said, breaking the silence. "People don't usually help strangers without expecting something in return." Jake tilted his head, as if genuinely puzzled by the statement. "I don't see it that way. If someone needs help and I can give it, why wouldn't I?" Richard was struck by the simplicity of the boy's logic. He glanced around the yard. The fence was patched together with mismatched pieces of wood, the grass uneven and sparse. In the corner of the yard, a rusty swing set leaned precariously, its chains rusted and broken. It was clear Jake's family didn't have much in the way of material possessions, but they were making the best of what they had. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," Richard said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "Your mother must be very proud." Jake grinned, glancing towards the house. "Mom works really hard. I just try to help out where I can." Richard fell silent for a moment, absorbing the boy's words. He was reminded of his own childhood. In a house not unlike this one, his parents had worked tirelessly to provide for their family, instilling in him the values of hard work and perseverance. Over the years, he'd somehow drifted away from those lessons, becoming consumed by the pursuit of wealth and status. Now, standing in this humble backyard, a wave of nostalgia and a pang of regret washed over him. "I'd like to do something for you and your family," Richard finally said. Jake straightened up, a hint of caution entering his expression. "We're doing okay, sir. We don't need anything." "It's not about need," Richard insisted. "It's about what's right. You helped me, and I want to reciprocate." Before Jake could respond, his mother stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Jake, come on in and wash up for lunch," she called. Then her gaze shifted to Richard. "Would you care to join us for lunch, sir? It's nothing fancy, but you're welcome to stay." Richard hesitated, unaccustomed to such spontaneous invitations, but the sincerity in her voice was undeniable. "I'd like that very much," he said, following her into the house. The kitchen was filled with the comforting aroma of baking bread and roasting vegetables. The small table, surrounded by mismatched chairs, was neatly set. Richard sat down, feeling strangely out of place in his expensive suit amidst the simple surroundings. Jake washed his hands and joined them at the table, his easy smile returning. Over lunch, Richard found himself drawn into their world. Jake talked about school, his friends, and his dream of becoming an engineer. His mother spoke of their community, her voice filled with quiet pride for the people who always looked out for each other. Richard listened intently, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. Despite his wealth and success, his own home felt cold and empty compared to this small house filled with laughter and genuine connection. After lunch, as they cleared the table, Richard turned to Jake's mother. "You've done an incredible job raising your son," he said, his voice sincere. "He has a kinder heart than most people I know." She smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you. He's a good boy, but we've had our share of struggles. We've learned to appreciate the little things." Richard nodded, his mind already buzzing with ideas. He didn't want to overstep, but he couldn't leave without doing something for them. This family had given him a gift he hadn't even realized he needed, a reminder of what truly mattered. Richard left their house that afternoon with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. As he drove back to his mansion, he began to make plans. This wasn't about charity, but about honoring the boy's selfless act and the resilience of his family. Jake and his mother deserved more than patched fences and worn furniture. They deserved stability and recognition for the quiet strength they displayed every day. The next morning, Richard made phone calls, a flurry of calls. He contacted former colleagues, contractors, and suppliers. By midday, the wheels were in motion. Within a week, trucks and workers began to arrive at Jake's house. Richard stood on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, orchestrating the renovations, while Jake and his mother watched in stunned disbelief from their porch. "You don't have to do this," Jake's mother said, her voice trembling as she watched the crew unload lumber and tools. "We were doing just fine." Richard turned to her, his expression earnest. "You were doing more than fine. You were thriving, but you gave me something I didn't know I was missing. Let me give something back." Jake, unusually quiet, stood beside his mother, his expression thoughtful. Richard knelt down, looking him in the eye. "You taught me something, Jake. Helping people isn't about money, it's about showing up. I want to show up for you." Over the next few weeks, the house was transformed. The sagging porch was replaced with sturdy timber, the roof repaired, the rusty swing set replaced with a bright new one. Inside, walls were painted, floors were refinished, and the kitchen was updated with modern appliances. At first, Jake tried to help with the renovations, hauling lumber and sweeping up, but Richard insisted he take a break. "Your job," Richard said with a smile, "is to be a kid for a while." Still, Jake couldn't resist sneaking out to watch the crew work, his eyes bright with curiosity as he observed them measuring, cutting, and building. A burly carpenter named Joe noticed his interest and invited him to help measure some wood. Soon, Jake was asking questions about tools and construction, his enthusiasm contagious. Richard watched from a distance, a sense of quiet pride swelling in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something meaningful, something that extended beyond himself. The boy's energy reminded him of the ambition he once possessed, before life became board meetings and stock portfolios. One evening, as the sun dipped low, the project neared completion. The family stood on the porch, taking in the transformation. Jake's mother turned to Richard, her voice thick with emotion. This isn't just a house anymore. It's a home. I don't know how to thank you. Richard shook his head, his voice gentle. You already have. You reminded me what life is supposed to be about. Family, connection, and purpose. I think I'm the one who should be thanking you. The final day of the project felt like a celebration. Neighbors stopped by to admire the changes, offering smiles and small gifts. Freshly baked bread, homemade jam, and potted plants. Jake's laughter echoed through the yard as he ran around, showing off the new swing set and the freshly painted rooms inside to his friends. The house, once worn and weary, now radiated a vibrant energy. Richard stood on the porch, leaning against the newly sturdy railing, watching the scene unfold. He hadn't felt this kind of joy in years, a simple, unadulterated joy that came from seeing others thrive. Jake's mother approached, holding out a glass of iced tea. She offered it to him with a warm smile. You did more than just fix up a house, she said softly. You gave us hope, and I think you found something for yourself too. Richard nodded, taking a sip of the tea. You're right, he admitted. I spent so many years chasing things I thought were important. Money, status, influence. But nothing compares to this. Nothing has ever felt this fulfilling. As the sun began to set, Jake joined them on the porch, still buzzing with energy. He looked at Richard, his expression serious. Thank you, Mr. Harding, he began, his voice earnest. I've been thinking a lot about what you did for us. I want to do something like this someday. I want to help people too. Richard placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, his voice firm and kind. You already are, Jake. Your kindness is what started all of this. Don't you ever lose that. The three of them sat together, watching the sky turn from gold to deep orange. The warmth of the day lingered, but there was a deeper warmth, born of connection, gratitude, and a shared sense of purpose. As Richard prepared to leave, Jake and his mother walked him to his car. The boy's beaming smile and his mother's tearful wave were etched in Richard's mind as he drove away. He realized this wasn't an ending, but just the beginning of a new chapter in all of their lives. The weeks that followed brought more changes. Jake's newfound curiosity about building blossomed into a passion. Richard arranged for him to shadow some of the contractors who had worked on the house. Jake soaked up the knowledge like a sponge. Richard found himself returning to Harlan often. Each visit, he felt less like an outsider and more like a part of something larger than himself. And for the first time in years, he felt truly content. The story ends where it began, in a small town with a big heart, where a simple act of kindness from a young boy reminded an old man of life's greatest lesson. It's not about what you have, but what you give.